campaign for the members of the community. Okay. La'achar mikein itbarer shegavu yoter mehatzorech. Later, it was discovered that they have a surplus in the collection. So they've collected so much that they have extra leftover money. Va'od hitbarer she'echad mitoshvei hashchuna chala v'hu zachuk b'chifot l'nituach b'chul. And then they find out that one of the members of the community has become ill and needs an urgent surgery in Chutz La'aretz. Okay? Ha'im hagaboim rishoim latet avur oto nituach kol ma shegavu l'tzarech hamishpachot ha'aniyot shel hashchuna o dilma rak ma shegavu yoter mima shehaya tzarich lahen. So there's really two questions. We're assuming that we can give the surplus to this guy, but would the gaboim be allowed to use their discretion to give all of it for this fellow's surgery? So that's the question. So he says, "Lefi kol hashitot hagaboim rishayim l'shanot b'sha'at hatzorech." So the response is, according to all opinions, the gaboim of the tzedakah would have the permission to make a change when they see a need. Kigon l'tzorech nituach b'chutz la'aretz, such as if they see that, let's say they collect $50,000 and they're going to give this guy the money so that he can get surgery. But that's only regarding the surplus. Ulam lekabe ikar hagivia nechluku haposkim mutar lahem l'shanot. But as far as the actual main amount that they collected, that they can actually use to give to the people in the community, that there's a machlokas as to whether they have permission to change from what was originally collected. Okay? So, v'hadvarim amurim rakim nitan lomar shahatzibur taram al dat gabay hashchuna sheyuchlu l'shanot al kol panim b'sha'at hatzorah. And the possibility of a gabay tzedakah being able to change when he sees a need, in other words, even though he collected for food and basic living essentials for the members of the community, if you hold that he's allowed to change that, that's only when the community trusts this gabay implicitly and they trust him to use the money at his discretion. Aval im hatzibur lo taram al da'atam v'hem emunim rak letafel b'tzrachim yom yomayim shel hamishpachot ha'aniyot. But if that's not the situation, in other words, the gabay tzedakah has set up his whole organization is based on Tomchei Shabbos, for example. And Tomchei Shabbos is food boxes for the poor. And he decides that he would like to take this week's or this month's collections for Tomchei Shabbos and give it to one person for surgery. Then it would seem to me that he's not allowed to change, even if he has a surplus. Because in that situation, there was no implicit trust placed in the gabay tzedakah that he could do whatever he wants. So when the community structure is such that the gabay tzedakah is entrusted to do whatever he feels is best, and there's no specific organization that he's collecting for other than taking care of the needs of the community, let's say it would be more akin to the rabbi's charity fund, right? So the rabbi's charity fund, the rabbi collects for needy people in the community, but it's not a descript kind of collection. And there's an assumption that whoever's giving is sort of trusting the rabbi that he'll use his discretion to give it to people who need the money the most. And usually he distributes the money, but this year he has a surplus. So what he said is, everyone would agree that if the rabbi has a surplus in his account, he can use that money at his discretion, even if it means giving it all to one person so that that person can have medical treatment. Okay? But there's a machlokes whether the rabbi would be allowed to use all of the money, forego getting people food for Yontif, and using that money to help someone get surgery. But that's only in a situation where it was set up that way, where, let's say, the rabbi's charity fund, there's implicit trust given to the rabbi to do with it as he deems appropriate. But if it's, let's say, an organization that where it's not a gabbai tzedakah that the people implicitly trust, but that he set up an organization for the specific objective of feeding people, giving people who don't have enough food for Shabbos, giving them food, and then he decides he'd like to change, then he's not allowed to use even a penny, even if he has a surplus from the account. That's what he is suggesting. And I think that's an important distinction that he's making. It certainly makes a lot of sense. So let's take a look at the biurim and see what the issues are. He says there is a machlokes as to whether the gabbai tzedakah, who's implicitly trusted, would be allowed to change the primary amount that's collected for another purpose. So he explains as follows. Let's see. He says, let's see. Yeah. I don't know why he starts with the letter Vav. He says, V'hinei harash kasav v'zelashona. The harav Reb Yosef Halevi kasav, dahadika amar l'shanosan l'chol mashi yirtzu, dafka l'davar shehu tzarech aniyim, kigon ksus, ubeslina ukavura. He says, he quotes another Rishon named Rabbi Yosef Halevi. Whenever we say that the gabbai tzedakah is allowed to use the money for whatever purpose he likes, it's dafka for something that is for the needs of the poor. In other words, a gabbai tzedakah still has to use the money for poor people. He can't say, I'm going to use the money to do a chesed for people who are not poor. So, for example, he's allowed to, at his discretion, choose whether it's going to be for clothing, whether it's going to be for rent for people to live, whether it's going to be to help bury the dead. He says, even though normally a kupa and a tamchoy, which is the two systems of tzedakah, one was on a daily basis, one was on a weekly basis, was usually for food, and it was understood that you were giving people food, money, either money for food or food itself. But the gabbai does have a right at his discretion to change that that fund when he feels that there's a greater need, provided that it's for the sake of the poor. But to use it for other purposes, let's say he wants to make sure that the mikveh is renovated, or that the shul has proper heating. Okay, that's not for the poor. That's for the general community. And it may be a virtuous thing that he wants to do, but he's not allowed to steal from the poor. This money was allocated for the poor. And how does he know this? Vehevi raya mehadetnan b'masech shkolim, mosar aniyim la'aniyim, mosar shvuyim l'shvuyim, mosar ani la'oso ani, mosar shavui la'oso shavui. So there's a Mishnah in Masech Shkolim that says as follows: if there was a general fundraiser for the poor, whatever is left over from that fundraiser must go to the poor. If there was a general fundraiser to help ransom people after they were kidnapped, which was a prevalent thing, as I mentioned back in the day, where every community had to worry about this. This is now going back, 800, 900 years ago. It says that, you'd have to, every community would have to occasionally do fundraisers when one of their dignitaries was kidnapped. And what? Well, you remember we were talking with Mordechai. He said people got used to it. And so if you do a fundraiser for kidnapped people and you have a surplus, you have to use that leftover for the same purpose. And furthermore, if you do a fundraiser for a specific poor person and you have a surplus, that surplus must be saved for that poor person. And the same thing if you're doing a fundraiser for a person who's kidnapped, that surplus has to be saved for that particular person. But he says, "V'nira li de'ein raya mima shehevi mehahi deshkolim. The hasam lo ayri b'ma'os shel kupa, ela al yedei mikre, shehutzruchu legabot ma'ot letzarech aniyim." He says, however, that's not really analogous to what we're talking about, where there's a community chest for tzedakah. He says, because there was a specific fundraiser for a specific cause, kagon malbushim, o shabo shamaniyim harbe dumya deshvuyim, such as, let's say, all of a sudden, they did a fundraiser to buy clothing for the winter for the poor, or they did a fundraiser because there was a whole influx of immigrants who came without anything on their backs. And that's where the Mishnah says that when you've raised funds, let's say Russian immigrants, you can't use that money to help other poor people because you disclosed to the public that you were using this money to help Russian immigrants. So you can't use that money for other purposes because that's deceptive practice. But when you have a general fundraising kitty, a community chest, there, when it was just a general a community fund for a benevolent fund, a charity fund, so then the community gets to decide how they want to use the money. They can change the money for whatever they like. And if there is a specific fundraiser, let's say, because now they discover that they've used this money to renovate the mikveh, for example, if they want to be able, and now all of a sudden the poor are discovered now to have a shortfall, they'll do another fundraiser. And they'll do it specifically to raise money for the poor to have food for Shabbos. The Garcinin Birushalmi Deshkolim, Mosar Aniyim La'aniyim, Mosar Shvuyim Lishvuyim, the Ein Memachin Biyad HaParnasim. And so the Yerushalmi's Girsa is to add those 4 words at the end that we don't protest to the providers of the community. Klomar, Imrei sheyesh tzarech b'davar u'ba'u l'shanot ein memachin biyadan. That even according to the Yerushalmi, even when they did a specific fundraiser for specific poor people or specific kidnapped people, we don't argue or we don't protest if the community leaders decide to use it for some other purpose. So that's an even stronger argument. So basically, he's now going to analyze this. He says, "Harei shaharav Yosef Halevi hevi raya l'shitasam limosar aniyim la'aniyim." He says, basically, Rav Yosef Halevi was trying to argue that you're not allowed to change the purpose of why this money was collected and use it for another purpose. But he says, and he brings a proof from the Mishnah that says whatever surplus you have, if it was raised for a specific group of poor people, it has to remain with that specific group of poor people. The harash dacharayos, the mosar aniyim la'aniyim hainu kishegavu la'aniyim yaduim. And the Rosh says that's only true when the fundraiser was specifically directed at a specific group of poor people. In Cain, buchrachim lomar, shema shekasav b'Yerushalmi ve'im memachin b'yad haparnasim, hainu kishegavu la'aniyim yaduim, v'chein kasav lahed yashach. And so therefore, according to the Yerushalmi, it's even more broad. Even when they specifically fundraised for specific poor people, if the community leaders decide that they'd like to change it, According to the Yerushalmi, they have a right to do that also. Ula, however, Vivinat Adam, Piresh Ba'ofen Acher Divrei Harash V'zel Lashona. He has a different way of understanding the words of the Rush. He says, Umasha Kosav Birushalmi De'ein Memachin Biyad HaParnasim Koi Al Reisha Demosar Aniyim Laniyim Demari Shagaval Aniyim Stam Velo Yidu. He says, when the Yerushalmi says that they that we don't protest and we allow latitude to the Gaboy Tzedakah to decide how to use that money, that's only when it was collected as a general fundraiser. The Inkain Ein Kan Misha Yizke V'Lachein Ein Memachin L'Shanot Ad Kan L'Shono. He says, and that's what the Yerushalmi means. So, according to him, everyone would agree that if it was directed fundraising for a specific cause and you have a surplus, you're not allowed to use that money for anything else. But he says, V'nira lanias daiti dezed dachuk ma'od, but that seems somewhat contrived to read the text that way. Achar kach matzasi b'shut achi ezer shekasav gam kein delo nira klal medivrei harash kamo shekasav b'binas adam. And then I discovered that Rav Chaim Oizer, who wrote Shilas Atshuvas Achi Ezer, agrees that that's not the correct way to read the text of the Rush. Okay, fine. Let's go to the next page. Just give me 1 second. Oh, okay. So we continue, and he says, "V'hinei haroshan al b'sof devar of kasav v'zel." But then the Rush writes at the very end, and he says, "V'garsinin b'Yerushalmi dishkalim, mosar niyam laniyam, mosar shvim l'shvim, ein memachin biyada parnasim, klomar imro sheyesh sorach b'davar v'olashanos ein memachin biyada." So the Rush himself concludes by saying that if the leaders see that there's another need, it's at their discretion to use the money for whatever they want. V'lo mevur b'dvarav imosar leparnasim l'shanos rak mosar hagavia o gam ikar hagavia. So what's ambiguous in the language of the Rush is if are they allowed to change the principle or only the surplus that they collected. That's the ambiguous part in the Rush. And mashu kasav ubo l'shanos below kasav ubo l'shanos hamos or mashma shagam ikar hagavia mutar l'shanot. The implication of the text is that they could even change the primary collection that they collected, the principle, even though they collected it for a specific purpose, they would be allowed to change it. So that would be one reading of the Rush, which would give even greater latitude to the Gaboy Tzedakah. B'hashach kosav behesper divrei harash b'zel l'shona. Wrote Solomar de'ein yecholin l'shanos be'ira derech mikra afilu lidvar mitzvah. He says, so the Shach explains that according to the Rush, you're not allowed to change the purpose of these funds if it was a directed fundraiser for a specific cause, even if you feel that there's a more compelling mitzvah at hand. Mikol makom kisharon aparnasim sheyesh sarach bedavar yecholim l'shanot lidvar mitzvah umash mashigam ikar hagavi yecholim l'shanot. He says, unless they see a great need, in which case they would be allowed to change. And it sounds like from the Shach also that they could even change the principle. Ulam b'machane Ephraim, and basically he's going back and forth to tell us that this is a machlokes, okay? So the bottom line is, when it's a directed fundraiser, it's a machlokes as to whether the Gaboy Tzedakah have the latitude to change the principle, but they could certainly change the surplus. But if there's no implicit trust placed in the Gaboy Tzedakah because it's an organization that is specifically for one cause, then they're never allowed to change anything, even the surplus. So we'll hold it here for today. And we'll have one more session in Mirz Hashem tomorrow.